Today we're going to remove the starter, and before we remove the starter we need to disconnect the negative cable on the battery. This is a side post terminal for the battery. I'm just removing this negative post here that holds the cable up against the side terminal of the battery. Next, I'm going to tuck it down out of the way so it doesn't come in contact with the battery again when we remove the starter. Next, I'm going to lift the vehicle up and I'm going to get access to the two starter bolts. There's a starter bolt on the left in this case, and there's one on the right. A lot of vehicles may have 3 starter bolts, so be aware that there could be 2 or 3 starter mounting bolts to remove. After the starter bolts have been removed, I'm going to now position the starter so I get access to the battery cable where it contacts the solenoid. This is held on by a nut, and I just unscrew the nut to remove this power cable coming from the battery that delivers power down to my starter solenoid. On top of the starter, there's a starter solenoid. The big nut holds that battery cable to allow power to go to the starter motor. After I remove that and tuck the wires out of the way, there is a smaller bolt or nut on the side that is attached to a smaller cable. This smaller cable goes back to the ignition switch. And anytime I push a button or turn a key to start the vehicle, this closes the contact in the solenoid to deliver power to the starter motor to crank the engine over. Next, I'm going to remove the starter down out of the way, and in this case I would put a new starter in, but we're going to show you how to bench test the starter. And the way you do this is you hook up the positive cable to a booster pack, and the negative just goes on the frame of the starter, and you can use a small screwdriver and jump between these two contacts, the positive big battery cable, and you can see it sparking across there to the ignition switch post. And on the other side here, when I complete those contacts by jumping the screwdriver across those two contacts, the starter motor will engage with the flywheel to crank the flywheel over. And then when I disengage the switch, it pulls the starter back into its housing. So after I bench test the starter, see that it's good, I'm going to put the starter back in and bolt it back up into place. There's some wires here. Make sure those wires are out of the way. I prefer to put the bolts in first. The reason why is we don't want any weight of the starter on those cables. We don't want to have the cable stretched or break off, and we want to make sure those cables are tight. So I'm going to position the starter in place and make sure that it's up there securely, because if you do drop the starter to the ground, it will ruin the starter motor because there's magnets, and those magnets shift, and then you have to go buy a new one. So we're going to hold the starter and then start those two mounting bolts, the one on the back side, the one on the front side, and we're going to start them in by hand. It's very important we start all of our bolts in by hand so that they don't cross thread. If they cross thread, then the motor won't be properly mounted to the engine block. After we've threaded them in by hand a few revolutions or turns, we're going to now screw the bolts into place using a ratchet, socket, and an extension. The extension will give me that added clearance so that I can be pretty quick at moving or putting the starter back into place. On the other side, We remove one of the extensions because there's less clearance between the subframe, and I'm just going to tighten this up into place. And we want to make sure and torque these two bolts to proper specification according to our service information guidelines. So after those two bolts are properly torqued with a torque wrench, both the front and back bolts, now we're going to put the cables back into place. When we remove the cables, you may also want to make note how many cables there is and what sizes they are and where they are positioned so that they're properly installed back into place when you put the starter back in. So the ignition switch we've got started there by hand, and then we're just going to snug that nut down where it controls off the ignition switch. And we don't want to crank this down, but we don't want it breaking loose, so make sure that they're snug and tight. If you over tighten these, I've seen where they can break the stud and then you have to buy a new starter. So again, we're just going to put those washers on. There's actually a lock washer here that keeps it from rotating off before we thread the nut back into place by hand. And then we're going to tighten that nut securely with the wrench. And again, this is very important anytime you're working on these cables, to make sure that the battery is disconnected. If the battery is connected, you can see my ratchets hitting on the frame. That would be a direct path from positive to ground, and it could create sparks. The wrench could get hot. It could burn my hand. Very important that we disconnect power from any power source. And after we have now put those back into place, now we can reconnect the battery. And these side terminal posts are made out of lead, so I want to be very gentle, thread it in by hand, and then tighten this post back into place. After the battery has been installed and hooked up, we're going to crank the engine over. You can see we cranked it over and it started, and we're done. That's all it takes.